Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today, I wanted to bring you a video on a subject that has always fascinated me, that being the theory of spontaneous human combustion. The idea that someone can suddenly burst into flames without an external cause has existed for centuries, but theories as to why this occurs differ widely. Some believe the source of the fire can come from within our bodies, while others have attributed this phenomenon as being from the hand of God. Of course, most dismiss the concept altogether, as there is just about no evidence for its existence to begin with, but this is part of the reason I wanted to make this video. Many supposed cases of spontaneous human combustion, which I'll call SHC for short, have been widely misunderstood and misinterpreted, and I want to try my best to present only the facts of these cases, and leave it up for you to decide if SHC is a probable or even a possible explanation for these deaths. As far as images go, there really isn't much I can show you, since those that exist are quite graphic, so I guess this video will be sort of an experiment for my channel. Personally, I like to put videos on in the background while doing other things, so if you're the same way, this is a great video for you. Of course, I'll still be showing images on screen when relevant, but they'll just be more spread out. I hope this isn't too jarring from my normal content, and if you have any thoughts about this format, please let me know down in the comments. And without further ado, let's begin with an early history of spontaneous human combustion. The first written account of the phenomenon comes from Danish anatomist Thomas Bartholin. In the mid-1600s, he wrote about two supposed cases. The first concerned an Italian knight who in the year 1470, after a night spent drinking at his home in Milan, was said to have suddenly burst into flames. The second concerned an unnamed Parisian woman who apparently went up in smoke and ashes while asleep. Despite her body being severely burnt, the straw mattress she laid on appeared undamaged. In both cases, it was said there was no obvious cause of the fire. Another early and quite famous account of spontaneous human combustion came out of a small village in Reims, France. In the year 1725, 67-year-old Jeannie Lemaire was found burnt to death on her kitchen floor. With her remains still smoldering, the only part of her that was spared by the fire were her legs. Her husband Jean Mallet was immediately assumed to be involved in her death, as there had been a rumor swirling in town that Jean was having an affair, and some thought he may have wanted his wife out of the picture. Soon, and without much evidence, Jean was convicted of murdering his wife and was sentenced to death. However, a young and renowned surgeon named Nicolas Lecat quickly came to Jean's aid, informing the public that Jeannie Lemaire had not been a victim of her husband, but rather of a mysterious phenomenon known as spontaneous human combustion, in which the human body ignites itself from the inside out. Lecat assured Jean Mallet's accusers that SHC was a reasonable explanation for what happened to Jean's wife. He explained that there were two main risk factors for SHC. First, alcoholism, and second, a lack of physical fitness. He also added that victims tended to be women. Jeannie Lemaire fit into all of these categories, and since there was no obvious evidence that Jean had killed his wife, he felt that the only reasonable conclusion was that Jeanne had fallen victim to SHC. Now, I hate to burst Nicholas's bubble, but there was another much more probable explanation for Jeanne's death. You see, the 67-year-old was known to stand near the kitchen hearth to warm herself, and her remains were found only about 1.5 feet from this heat source. She was also said to get intoxicated every day, so one could speculate that she had carelessly grazed the fire, perhaps even with alcohol on her person, and was quickly consumed by flames. This proposal of events could have helped exonerate her husband, but regardless, Jean Mallet's accusers actually bought Lecat's proposal of spontaneous combustion and acquitted Jean of all charges. But despite Lecat's victory, Jean Mallet would never be the same, and he would spend the rest of his life in a mental institution. While these early accounts received much attention in certain medical and academic circles, we have none other but Charles Dickens to thank for bringing this idea into popular culture. Quick spoiler alert for anyone planning to read the behemoth that is Bleak House. But in 1852, Dickens published a chapter of the novel in which his alcoholic character, Mr. Crook, was found reduced to a pile of ash on his bedroom floor, having apparently burst into flames without cause. Of course, Bleak House was fictional, but what drew some criticism to Dickens was his insistence to his readers that the phenomenon was real. Many believed him at his word. After all, he was known to be realistic when portraying other medical conditions and phenomena, So why would he now choose to include something so strange as SHC in one of his novels if it wasn't at least possible? But many did not accept his claims, and even denounced him for misleading his readers. The most notable opposition came from one of his own friends, scientist George Lewes, who said that the circumstances of Mr. Crook's death are beyond the limits of acceptable fiction and give credence to a scientific impossibility. In response, Dickens wrote that I do not willfully or negligently mislead my readers, and before I wrote that description, I took pains to investigate the subject. There are about 30 cases on record, of which the most famous is that of Countess Cornelia. This most famous case Dickens was referring to was actually that of Countess Cornelia Zangari Bandi, an Italian noblewoman whose bizarre death was the subject of much interest among Victorians. On the night of March 14th, 1731, the 66-year-old Countess ate dinner at her residence, where her mood was described as dull and heavy. She went to bed shortly after, where she spoke to one of her maids for about 3 hours before falling asleep. The next morning, that same maid noticed that the Countess was not awake by her usual time. She let herself into the room, where she found the following sight. 4 feet from the bed, there was a heap of ashes, 2 legs untouched, from the foot to the knee, with their stocking on. Between them was the lady's head, whose brains, half the back part of the skull, and the whole chin were burnt to ashes, amongst which were found 3 fingers blackened. All the rest was ashes. This account states that her bed was not damaged by the fire, and that her blankets had been pushed to the side as though she had just climbed out of bed. When it came to possible explanations for the fire, it was said that an empty, soot-covered oil lamp was found on the ground near the Countess's remains. Some to this day hold the belief that the Countess fell onto the lamp after climbing out of bed, thus igniting her and rendering her immobile. But despite this evidence, some felt that the source of the fire must have come from the Countess herself, and many respected figures of her time tried their hand at explaining her fiery death. One said figure was respected philosopher and scientist Monsignor Bianconi, who concluded the following: the fire was caused in the entrails of the body by inflamed effluvia of her blood, by juices and fermentations in the stomach, by the many combustible matters which are abundant in living bodies for the uses of life. He added that this fire was fueled by a copious amount of alcohol in her system, as well as her body fat. This explanation, that the fire began somewhere inside the body, was common amongst early reports of SHC, and has even persisted in some circles today, but we'll get more into that later. But while we're on the subject of alcohol, I should point out a very important fact of this case that was often overlooked. The Countess was known to bathe in camphorated spirits, a very flammable alcohol which helped her skin issues. Considering this, if there had been an open flame in the Countess's bedroom, it is possible that she brushed it while climbing out of bed and may have quickly caught on fire and burnt to death. But of course, in the original report, there was no mention of a flame having been lit in the bedroom, so the cause of the Countess's death remains a subject of much speculation. Now that we've covered some of the earliest reports of SHC, I want to move on to 3 relatively recent cases. The first we'll cover, and perhaps the most famous, is the death of Mary Reeser, also known as the Cinder Lady. At 9 p.m. on July 1st, 1951, 67-year-old widow Mary Reeser said goodbye to her grown son Richard, who had visited her apartment for the evening. Richard said that his mother had been quite anxious that night, as she was trying to arrange a trip back home to Pennsylvania to visit her friends, and was worried about her plans falling through at the last minute. After her husband's death, Mary moved to St. Petersburg, Florida to be closer to her son and grandchildren, but found the Florida heat to be stifling, and was often overcome by homesickness. When her son left the apartment, we know that Mary changed out of her day clothes and into a nightgown. She had taken 2 sedative pills earlier that afternoon, but had told her son, who was also a doctor, that she would likely take 2 more after he left, so this is what investigators assume she did. We also know that she opened the living room windows before reclining in her overstuffed chair and lighting up a cigarette to enjoy before going to bed. At about 5 a.m., Mary's landlady, Pansy Carpenter, woke up to get her newspaper and thought she smelled smoke in the building, but figured it was just from an overheated water pump. She went back to her apartment, and around 8 a.m. received a telegram addressed to Mary Reeser. Now, I couldn't confirm this, but some sources said that this telegram was from a friend who wanted to confirm Mary's travel plans. Knowing that her trip was set in stone would have likely put Mary's mind at ease, but unfortunately, it was news that she would not receive. Upon knocking at her door, the 67-year-old did not answer. Pansy Carpenter then tried to go inside of the apartment, but found the door handle too hot to touch. Obviously concerned, she called for a couple of house painters nearby to open the door, but once they finally got inside, a horrifying scene awaited them. Most of Mary Reeser, and the chair she had been sitting in, had been reduced to ash. The only parts of her that could be identified were some vertebrae, a human skull shrunken to the size of a teacup, and an undamaged foot still wearing a slipper. Some plastic items in her apartment had been softened, but there was relatively little damage done to the place, all things considered. Besides damage to the ceiling above and the floor beneath her, as well as soot coating most of the room, there was hardly any indication that a fire had taken place, let alone a fire intense enough to cremate a human body. Perhaps the strangest detail of the scene was the shrunken skull, which, as you may have guessed, was not something to be expected in such a fire, as when the human body is subjected to extreme heat, the skull expands rather than shrinks. But it appears there was some confusion over this report, and in researching this, I found several references to an unnamed fire researcher who apparently viewed Mary's remains and said that her skull had in fact not been shrunken. However, I couldn't find this researcher's first-hand account, so the state of Mary Reeser's skull remains up for debate. Questions immediately rose about the origin of the fire, and at first, the answer seemed simple. Mary was known to be smoking that night, and it seemed probable that she had simply dozed off from her sedatives and dropped the cigarette into her lap, thus igniting her highly flammable nightgown and herself. As heavily sedated as she was, it was entirely possible that she was none the wiser to her own destruction. Samples of Mary's remains and surroundings were sent to the FBI, but no traces of accelerant were found, which helped to rule out foul play. You may be wondering why Mary Reeser's death, with its rather simple explanation, has become one of the most famous supposed examples of spontaneous human combustion. Some strange reports may have helped create this mythos, one of which came from an anonymous letter sent to police soon after her death. "A ball of fire came through the open window and hit her," it said. "I seen it happen." This strange report led some to believe that Mary had been a victim of so-called globe lightning. Now, this really merits a video of its own, but to be brief, globe lightning is an unexplained phenomenon in which a glowing, spherical orb is seen floating or traveling in midair. There have been thousands of reports of globe lightning spanning thousands of years, with specific details such as color, sound, and size varying widely. Damage also varies, with some reports saying the globe silently vanishes, and others that it explodes, causing catastrophic damage or even death. But very little is known about this phenomenon or why it occurs, and it's almost impossible to prove or disprove its role in Mary Reeser's death. And as far as the anonymous note, it was eventually ruled out as a hoax. There was also the theory that Mary had been a victim of your run-of-the-mill lightning strike, but investigators found no physical evidence to support this. Yet another aspect of the case that made some turn to supernatural explanations was some confusion over the temperature of the fire needed to cremate Mary's body. You see, after her death, some papers reported that for a human body to be cremated, it would need to be heated at 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 hours. Obviously, this is a very high temperature, and you would expect to see much more damage to the room and the apartment as a whole if Mary Reeser's body had been burning at this temperature. However, this report was quite misleading, as in most crematoriums, a body is burnt at about 1,600 degrees for an hour and a half to achieve full cremation. Additionally, the body can be cremated at a lower temperature if the body has a longer amount of time to burn. But you may be wondering, as I was, how Mary's body was able to burn for such a long period of time. After all, the human body is 70% water and is not known to be particularly flammable. A commonly cited explanation for this is called the wick effect, which states that a human body can burn for a long period of time when melted body fat is absorbed by clothing, which acts like the wick of a candle, hence the name. And seeing as fires are self-limiting, Mary's body would have burnt until there was no fuel left, and only a pile of ashes remained. Additionally, according to an article by Live Science, fires typically burn upwards instead of outwards, meaning that it's not unusual for a fire to be limited to only a small portion of a room. As you can see, the case of Mary Reeser, who came to be known as the Cinder Lady in the weeks and months after her death, has more logical explanations than illogical. A story quite reminiscent of Mary's is that of Michael Faraday, the 76-year-old Irishman who was found burnt to death in his home in 2010. Unfortunately, we know much less about the circumstances of his death than Mary Reeser's, so I'll just give you a brief rundown on the facts that we do know about his case. Michael Faraday was estimated to have died on December 22, 2010, at his home in Galway, Ireland. He was found on the floor laying on his back, with his head closest to the fireplace, which investigators said that he had been using on the night of his death. His body was described as totally burnt, but besides scorch marks on the ceiling above him and the floor beneath him, there wasn't much fire damage found in the apartment. This case can be reasonably explained in many of the same ways we tried to explain Mary Reeser's, but part of the reason this story received worldwide attention was because of the coroner's ruling on cause of death. This fire was thoroughly investigated, he said, and I'm left with the conclusion that this fits into the category of spontaneous human combustion, for which there is no adequate explanation. According to the BBC, forensic experts did not believe that the fire in the fireplace had been the reason Michael Faraday caught on fire, and added that they found no trace of accelerant on his remains. Of course, this conclusion was met with much pushback, and skeptics cited many of the alternate explanations we've already covered. But it appears the ruling still stands to this day. Now, the cases of Mary Reeser and Michael Faraday are only two of dozens that fit a very specific profile often seen in these cases, so instead of telling you more variations of the same story, I wanted to tell you one of the outliers. That being the case of Jeannie Saffin, a woman who perished in a bewildering fire of an unknown origin. In 1982, Jeannie was living with her brother and elderly father in Edmonton, a town in North London, and on the afternoon of September 15th, Jeannie was sitting with her father in the kitchen when he noticed that his daughter had suddenly caught fire. He called for his son-in-law, Don Carroll, that was visiting at the time, and they tried their best to put out the flames. After calling an ambulance, Jeannie was transported to the hospital, where she would succumb to her injuries 8 days later. Her official cause of death was bronchopneumonia, which was caused by an inflammation of the bronchi. The reason Jeannie's case has received so much attention on the subject of spontaneous human combustion is primarily because of some strange statements made by witness Don Carroll. He was quoted as saying that there was nothing alight in the kitchen except the pilot light on the grill, and that despite this, he remembers flames coming out of her mouth and her midriff. He added that she was roaring like a dragon as the flames shot out of her mouth. As you can probably guess, these were very unusual statements, and in my research, I couldn't find another example of a person appearing to shoot flames out of their mouth while on fire. The case also drew much interest because of reports that her clothing was hardly burnt, seeming to imply that the fire did not come from an outside source. However, it seems this report was simply wrong, as Don Carroll was originally quoted as saying that her clothes were in ribbons and were charred black. The confusion on the state of her clothing likely came from first responders who reported that her clothes were not on fire, referring to the fact that they were no longer on fire rather than unburnt. And as for the report that flames were shooting out of her mouth, this didn't seem to line up with the physical evidence. A doctor caring for Jeannie said that they found soot in her nose, but the back of her mouth appeared undamaged. Investigator and skeptic Joe Nickel pointed out that the detail of Jeannie roaring like a dragon was absent from Carroll's original police statement, and actually came from a statement he made 12 years after Jeannie's death. As you probably know, eyewitness testimony is notoriously inaccurate, and a person's recollection of an event, especially a traumatic one, can change with time. But even if we dismiss this as a false memory, the question of where the fire came from remains a mystery. However, an important fact on this point comes from Carroll's original police statement, in which he said the following: "I made a point of checking on the gas cooker and saw that it was not on, and saw that my father-in-law had his pipe in his hand, and I checked it and saw that it was fresh tobacco which had not been lit." This account prompted Joe Nickel to beg the question, did the elderly Mr. Saffin previously knock the hot ashes from his pipe, and did an ember land in Jeannie Saffin's lap? Support for this theory comes from the fact that the kitchen door and windows were open, creating a draft in the room that could have easily carried embers onto Jeannie's cotton dress and nylon sweater. This theory is quite probable when you look past the frankly unbelievable parts of this story, and if we're to apply Occam's razor to this case, the simplest explanation may just be the best one. Besides the three we just covered, There are dozens more reported cases of spontaneous human combustion, most of which fall into the Mary Reeser and Michael Faraday category. By that, I mean a lone elderly person being found reduced to ash near some sort of heat source. Often in these cases, the person was known to be drinking near the time of their death. And while academics of old hypothesized that alcohol in the stomach could act as an accelerant to some sort of internal spark, it is much more likely that alcohol, as a depressant, causes a person to be careless around fire. And if they happen to catch on fire while intoxicated, they may be physically unable to put it out quickly before they are completely consumed. Skeptic Benjamin Radford, in an article which I'll link down below, brings up the important point of prevalence of SHC reports. There are 7 billion people in the world, he says, and yet we don't see reports of people bursting into flames while walking down the street. No one has ever been seen, filmed, or videotaped suddenly bursting into flames. It always happens to a single person left alone near a source of ignition. He adds that if there was a way for living organisms to spontaneously combust, we would expect to hear about animals occasionally exploding, yet these accounts are non-existent. Radford and Nickel, along with many other skeptics, believe the profile of supposed SHC victims is too narrow to indicate that any person, at any given time, can burst into flames without an external cause. Rather, these victims being elderly, somewhat immobile, and found near a source of ignition indicates that they were likely victims of a very much external flame. Once again, the simplest explanation is probably the best one. So, does spontaneous human combustion exist? Probably not, but this hasn't stopped us from letting our imaginations run wild with the concept. In so many of these cases, especially the older ones, it almost felt like bystanders wanted SHC to be the answer, even when there was clear evidence to the contrary. I could speculate as to why this is, but I'm honestly not sure. If you have any thoughts as to why SHC has prevailed as a belief for so long, I would love to read it in the comments below. I'll also have my sources and some interesting articles linked in the description if you want to dig deeper into this concept, because there were so many more stories I could have included if not for time. But to go ahead and end this, because it has started raining and I hope it's not messing with the audio too much, I just want to say thank you so much for watching this video. I've really enjoyed researching this topic, and it's probably one of the most fascinating rabbit holes I've ever fallen down, so I hope this was as interesting to you as it was to me. If you have any stories you would like me to cover in the future, please feel free to let me know down in the comments, and I would love to look into it. And again, thank you so much for watching. Your support truly means the world. I hope you have a blessed day, and as always, stay safe.